Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Well, today I want to look at sanctions against Russia in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and try to answer the question, are sanctions working? Certainly, if you speak to Russian central bankers, the energy minister, or Russian economists, you often hear the line that no, they've had almost no effect at all. Putin has been, in this respect, very affirmative that the ruble is still stable, the Russian budget is still largely in balance, Russian external debt is low, and that last year, despite the big sanctions adopted against Russia by the EU and the United States, the Russian economy only went down by 0.2%. Now, there's some truth in this because Russia was not one of the world's most indebted or financially weak countries before it invaded Ukraine, and therefore, unlike many other countries around the world, was in a relatively strong position to resist, at least initially, the impact of sanctions. And there are some other reasons as well why Putin may feel that he can still be quite defiant about sanctions. For example, oil and gas constitute about 60% of Russia's of foreign earnings and therefore its budget. And it's true that 80% of oil and gas went to the West before the invasion of Ukraine. And much of this market, of course, has been lost as, for example, a country like Germany reduces its dependency on Russia from over 50% in terms of natural gas down to 15%. But the Russians have had some success in transferring their energy markets to Asia, trying to sell more gas to China, although no big new deals were signed when President Xi visited Moscow last week. But in the case of India, for example, Russia has multiplied by 22 times the amount of oil that it shipped to India over the last year. And India now constitutes over 50% of the Russian oil export market. In the Middle East and Africa, also, Russia has found new consumers, even if it has had to accept that it's going to sell its oil at a vastly reduced price. Another reason why Russia has resisted well up until now is, of course, not every country in the world is imposing sanctions against Russia. If you look at, for example, the vote in the UN General Assembly a couple of weeks back to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, 41 countries sat on the fence and abstained from the resolution. Okay, 41 is not a majority. 140 countries plus voted to condemn Russia, but those 41 represent over 2/3 of the world's population and therefore the world's consumers. Russia also is mindful of the fact that even the EU and the United States have limits as to how far they can go to impose sanctions, because you want to hurt the other guy without hurting yourself too much in the process. So even though the EU, for example, has adopted so far 10 rounds of sanctions against Russia, things like cooperation on nuclear power, or imports of Russian liquefied natural gas and liquefied natural petroleum, gold sales and all of these kind of things, imports of certain Russian raw materials, of fertilizers, for example, are still going ahead. Indeed, just this week, the European Union came up with a new measure to try to prevent Russian energy firms gaining access to the European LNG infrastructure to increase sales. So there's always a loophole out there somewhere that you find and that you have to tighten. And the irony is that as Europe has clamped down on Russian piped gas, it's bought more Russian liquefied natural gas. The Russians have also been very good at finding workarounds. For example, Moscow has bought a lot of old oil tankers on the international spot market to replace the Western tankers, which it used to use to transport its oil. It's trying to create its own insurance market to get around the fact that it no longer has access to Western insurance for its shipping as well. It's used the Ukrainian grain deal to make the point that it should be allowed also to have unrestricted sales of its own grain and fertilizers. There are always trade-offs here that we have to accept. And Russia finally has been quite adept at creating its own parallel system of imports using countries like Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Central Asia. It's been also accessing computer chips and advanced electronics from China and so on. And therefore, do not be surprised when you read reports that, for example, a country like Armenia is importing 8 times more fridges and iPhones than it would do in a normal year, because Russia is then accessing those goods to take the chips out of those appliances to use them for missile production. So yes, it's a game of cat and mouse, inevitably, and will be for some time to come. But does that mean to say that there's nothing that we can do or should do? Can the sanctions regime be improved? Well, in the first place, we have to recognize that we're in it for the long haul. All sanctions, think of South Africa under the apartheid regime or Colonel Gaddafi after some terrorist attacks, all sanctions take a long time. In those 2 cases, over 20 years before finally the regimes decided to cooperate with the international community. So we have to be patient. Sanctions are applied in a cumulative step-by-step way, so inevitably they have a cumulative step-by-step impact. Secondly, we need to plug the loopholes, obviously, and make it harder for Russia to evade the sanctions. For example, Turkey, under pressure, a couple of weeks ago announced that it would no longer allow its territory to be used for exports to Russia. Another good thing in this respect has just come out of the Alliance for Democracy Summit in Washington, where the US has concluded a so-called transparency initiative with 20 countries to make small and medium-sized companies reveal their beneficial owners. This will help, for example, to protect us against Russian oligarchs who set up shell companies abroad in tax havens like the British Virgin Islands or Cyprus or the Bahamas, where they can park their illicit gains. So those kind of things would help as well. Thirdly, we also, of course, can look at confiscating more Russian assets abroad. For instance, the EU has set up a task force to see to what extent it would be legally permissible to confiscate the 300 billion euros that the Russian central bank has in the EU at the present time, and use those, of course, to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine afterwards as well. And then we also need to look, and this will be my final point, the future, because when the war in Ukraine is over, one carrot for Putin will be the possibility of getting Western sanctions lifted on him. But on the other hand, Putin's Russia may still be a threat to the West, and therefore we're going to have to look at which sanctions we don't lift but keep in place for our own long-term protection. For example, embargoes on advanced electronics or computers or missile components or whatever that could help Russia to rebuild in an even more modern form its defense capabilities in the future. That's going to be a difficult debate. But my conclusion is, let's not despair. Yes, the sanctions are not perfect, but just this week, Oleg Deripaska, one of Putin's loyal lieutenants and a Russian billionaire, said that Russia was running out of money and would run out of money entirely next year. He said that Russian companies were being asphyxiated by the lack of direct foreign investment. Russian central bankers have said that this year the decline in GDP will be much larger than 0.2% and in the region of 3 to 5%, or even worse than that. As well. We do know that Russia is now finding it more difficult to reconstitute some of its military production because of the lack of spare parts and electronic components from abroad. So yes, the sanctions are applying pressure. They're not a panacea which by themselves will make Putin withdraw from Ukraine, but they are an essential part in communicating to the Russian regime and the Russian people that Putin will not succeed in his objectives and that the more he continues to defy the international community, the higher the economic price and the slower the recovery inevitably is going to be for Russia and its population. Thank you for watching and listening, and I look forward to engaging with you again next week.